Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 64 of the Church Revitalization Podcast. We're glad you're with us, and as always, Scott Ball is on the other side of the microphone from me. My name's AJ, by the way. Hey, Scott.
Hey, AJ. So glad to be talking to you today about a very relevant topic. I think it's increasingly relevant in sort of our pandemic / post-pandemic time period.
Yeah, for sure. We are most certainly in a leadership crisis in the church. Only we have been for decades. This is COVID just pointed it out to us.
That's right. Or as Aubrey would say, we don't have so much a leadership crisis as we have a leadership development crisis.
Yeah. So this week's title is Why Your Church Isn't Developing Leaders, how to create a culture of empowerment. And so that's really what we're focusing in on today.
That's right. So we are taking it from sort of the negative tack, but I think sometimes it can be helpful to know what to do by fully understanding what you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're going to be pointing out. And I think that as we go through these three, what we would call alternatives to empowerment, you're going to see a lot of maybe your own church's leadership in this and going, oh, okay, this maybe explains why we haven't been developing leaders the way we want to.
Let me insert also that this is taken directly out of the book Building Leaders.
Yeah.
Here's a picture of it for our viewers. Building Leaders by Aubrey Malfers.
Copy as well.
Yeah.
I feel like yours is shinier than mine.
It has a little bit different color, doesn't it?
Look at that.
Yeah. Maybe it's newer. This is co-written by Aubrey with our friend Will Mancini as well.
Mine is also...
You have an autograph copy?
By Aubrey.
Oh, man.
He wrote, just Ob. If you know Aubrey, if you've met Aubrey, he likes to be called Ob. So
I'm going to have to get him to sign my book.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is directly out of chapter 3 of Building Leaders. We encourage you to pick up a copy of the book because it's chock full of great information just like this. But we really wanted to hone in on this, and it was really succinctly done in chapter 3 on empowering leaders. So that's where we're coming from today. Scott, hit us with the definition out of the book.
Yeah. This is actually, if you're wanting to follow along in your own edition of the book, I think this is on page 40 or somewhere in that area. He says, empowerment is the intentional transfer of authority to an emerging leader within specified boundaries from an established leader who maintains responsibility for the ministry. Now, if you read this chapter, he goes into detail really on every key term in that definition, from intentional to and what an emerging leader is versus an established leader and all that. But I want to focus on the two key terms because they're the terms that play into the alternatives to empowerment. And one is authority, AJ, the other is responsibility. So the difference between authority and responsibility. Let's start with authority. AJ, what do we mean when we talk about authority?
Yeah, authority is decision-making power. So, and that's important. And don't just say, oh yeah, decision-making power. But I mean, seriously, if you have people, underneath you organizationally, allowing somebody else to make decisions is a big deal. And so, and as we go through this, you'll see, why that's so important
Right.
as we get into like these three alternatives to empowerment. But decision-making power has got to be a part of, the authority that's given to an emerging leader so that they can, stretch their leadership wings a little bit and give opportunity though for growth by you or whoever their person is that has granted them that decision-making power.
Yeah, so we have a couple of different sort of analogies or metaphors that we're going to be using throughout the course of this episode. And I want to introduce one of them here. When you think about authority, think about driving a car or a student driver in a car. Certainly they have to do some book learning and some training on understanding the rules of the road. Certainly there's some mentorship happening in putting them in the passenger seat up front, letting them sit there and observe the way that you drive. Hopefully you're a good example using your turn signals and, you obeying the rules of the road, so to speak. But at some point, they have to sit as a student driver in that driver's seat. They have to use the turn signal and the steering wheel and the gas and the brake. Or if you're teaching them, how to drive a manual transmission, how to go and change gears, and when's the right time to press the clutch, and all these things. Like they have to do that. There's no real leadership of the car, so to speak, without putting them in that driver's seat. And so when we talk about authority or decision-making power, that doesn't mean they have unfettered control over the car, right, AJ? You might say they have times they're allowed to drive and not drive. They can only drive during the daytime, or you can determine how many people are sitting in the car with them when they are driving. They can only go to certain places, but they still have decision-making authority or power when they're sitting in the driver's seat with whatever constraints you've put around them. But they can't really be driving the car unless they're sitting in the driver's seat driving the car. Okay. Yeah. So the second term that's important as it relates to empowerment is responsibility. So what do we mean when we talk about responsibility?
Yeah. So the maybe upline leader needs to maintain ownership and for the final outcomes of the decisions being made by somebody beneath him in authority. And so, and again, we're going to unpack this as we go on, but and this is really a relationship builder. For a leader to maintain responsibility, even though he's given up some authority. First of all, that's a lot of trust given to somebody. Hopefully, they've earned it. But from the recipient side, also there's security in that they've got this relationship with you or whoever their leader is above them, that they know they've been given some responsibility, some authority, but that you still, as a leader above them, might have the final responsibility. Your neck's on the line for what they do, and you accept that, and they accept that. That's a trust building relationship, and hopefully one that's mutually respected by both parties.
Right. Okay. So, and Jim Collins, this is in the book. It's not included in the article if you go and read it online, but it is in the book. A reference to Jim Collins' metaphor for the mirror and the window. This idea that when things go well, you kind of treat it like a window. You're just looking through it. But if things don't go well, the outcome is poor. Think of it like a mirror. It reflects back on you.
Yeah.
So if it's a window, like you led through that leader, and if it doesn't work out well, it's more like a mirror, and it reflects back on you and what you didn't do well. So, so now that we understand we have authority and we have responsibility, let me briefly touch back on the definition of what empowerment is, and then we can walk through these alternatives to empowerment. So empowerment is the intentional transfer of authority, right? So decision-making power to an emerging leader. So we're letting go of that. We're letting go of authority within specified boundaries. It's not unfettered, from an established leader who maintains responsibility. So I'm keeping the ownership, the responsibility, the outcome for the ministry. So this is our definition of what healthy empowerment looks like. We're releasing decision-making power and we're maintaining responsibility for the outcome. Yep. Okay. This creates, the book kind of outlines sort of three logical alternatives. If you look at these if you were to kind of grid it out, which the book actually does, you've got authority and responsibility. So you can release one or keep one, release both, keep both. So it kind of creates these logical alternatives. And we want to walk through all three. They happen in churches all the time. So let's start with the first one, which can be positive or negative. Okay. So not all three of these are bad. This first one can be good in certain situations, and it's directing. So walk me through what is directing and what is authority and responsibility when we're talking about directing.
Yeah. So directing. So let me say directing on the positive side is because it's temporary, likely not permanently directing, except in the case in which a position will just always be a directed position. If you're trying to build leaders and raise them up in the organization, directing will always be temporary. And directing is the case in which both authority and responsibility are maintained by the upline level leader.
Right.
They refuse or choose not to relinquish authority and responsibility. They keep the person below them always in a directed position. That person is really they're never given anything that would allow them to grow and raise up in experience, in authority and responsibility.
Right. So let's take two examples where this would be an okay situation. So one would be take a frontline position like your greeters. Mm-hmm. It's not a high degree of responsibility anyway. Like it's not a high level leadership type thing. They're not really leading others. They're just leading themselves, and they're kind of just executing a task. So it's completely okay, I think, and maybe even optimal for this to be a directing type relationship. I'm just going to tell you how you ought to be doing greeting, and I'm going to take responsibility for if it's good or bad. So if it's not working out, then I probably need to tell you how to do it differently. So I think that's a totally okay way to handle frontline type volunteer positions. Another situation, this is the one the book lays out, is if you have someone in a new staff position, for example, like this is our second metaphor that we're maybe tracking through these examples. You've just recently hired a new worship pastor. When he's first coming on staff, you would probably still, as the senior pastor, you're kind of telling him, here's going to be the order of service. Here's the songs you should sing. Here's the way that we're going to do them. And while he's getting his feet under him, learning the ropes, understanding the way things are done, getting his feet under him, that would be acceptable for a season. But to your point, AJ, it would be temporary. Mm-hmm. If you always told him what to do, and always took sort of ownership of the outcome of that wouldn't be a healthy situation. At some point, you got to let him or her take ownership of making some decisions within that ministry, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, if you never did, I mean, they're not a worship leader, right? They wouldn't even be able to use that title. They would be vocalist or musician, center stage vocalist / musician.
That's right.
Not worship leader.
So in some instances, directing is appropriate. In other instances, directing is inappropriate. If you've got a qualified leader in a ministry like that, like you've hired a worship pastor, that worship pastor ought to have a degree of authority over shaping the programming and the music and selecting music and that kind of thing. And yet you still take ownership of the outcome. That's empowerment. You would, if it went really well, you would be, putting praise onto that guy and saying, man, yeah, didn't he do a great job? Didn't she do a great job? If it didn't go well, you wouldn't say, oh, it's all his or her fault, right? You're going, I probably could have done a better job leading him or her, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's example one. And the first alternative to empowerment is directing. And if you look at your own church and your own leadership and everything that you're doing is directing, you're directing all your positions, then it's no wonder you don't have the leadership development you want to see. Yeah. Because you can't direct everything, right? It's just not possible. Yeah. And you're not growing any leaders because you'd be stunting the leadership development of those folks if you're always telling them what to do.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, this could be a personal thing. You might be carrying baggage from other positions that you were in that has led you, developed you into a leader that constantly directs and never empowers. Could be a faith step that you need to take to be a little bit more open-handed with your ministry. I mean, in all cases, God doesn't set up ministries for it to be like one top dog and that it forever. I mean, the gospel's supposed to go out. So should leaders in the church be developed and empowered to multiply the effects of what you've been blessed with as a leader. That's right.
This is the competency bias at play, right? This
Yeah.
feeling like if it's going to be done right, it's got to be done by me. So if you're a type C in the DISC profile, or if you're a type 1 on the Enneagram, or generally speaking, like a type A type person, this might be a struggle for you. Like this might be something you're regularly dealing with because you have these perfectionistic tendencies and a feeling like it has to be done a particular way and there's one right way. Then you're probably going to have a tendency to want to lead in this way.
Yeah.
Sort of directing. Okay. The second alternative, AJ, what is it?
The second one is abdicating, and this is sort of the opposite of directing. This is when authority.
This would be the opposite of empowerment entirely, right?
For sure. Yeah. And so, yeah, when you give away, a leader gives away both responsibility for the ministry altogether. So basically, just like, here you go. I'm hands off. I don't want responsibility for what you do. And I don't want the authority to do what you do. So this is the leader that has chosen not to lead at all.
Yeah. And the book makes a really good point in this. I don't think that this happens usually consciously. I think it happens more out of neglect. And then the book says it's perpetuated due to stress and time constraints. And I think this is true. One of the things that it's very common in churches that have a lot of committees is that the pastor will essentially go, well, that's not really my thing. There's fill in the blank committee. Well, they make that decision and I don't sit on that. I don't sit on that team. And, this is how you have rogue committees and rogue teams and rogue volunteers and you can't get mad about it, because you've abdicated the responsibility. You've said, not my problem.
Yeah.
And they're making their decisions. And this is actually, I think, a breeding ground for conflict. It's also a breeding ground, I think, for people just to not serve. Because I think on one level, we think that what people want is this. They want the ability to make decisions and to be responsible for the outcome, but it's not really. I think most people want there to be someone to share that responsibility with them. It makes them feel comfortable in their position. And going back to our car metaphor, imagine, to use a student driver illustration, imagine an instructor exiting the vehicle at the moment the student climbs behind the wheel.
For the first time.
This will show a blatant disregard for both the driver and the car.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't care what happens to the car. I don't care what happens to the driver. And this is what happens in our leadership means we don't really care about those leaders and we don't really care about the ministry that they're doing if we abdicate both the responsibility and the authority to these teams.
Yeah, one of the most common things, we didn't talk about this earlier, Scott, but I bet you'll agree with me. We see this all the time in finance in the church. So pastors wear it like a badge of honor. I don't have anything to do with that. Money is behind the firewall. It's in the lockbox.
Yeah.
And like, come on, that's a complete abdication of financial authority or responsibility over the church. Now, I'm not saying go back and become the director, but many pastors abdicate when it comes to that. And you know what? Because they willfully do that, it comes back to haunt them sometimes later whenever, there's an initiative that they really would like to get done or some change they would like to get made. And now they're like, oh, I've got to work through the finance committee. It has to go this and this. There's all these hoops that we have to jump through. And, maybe it's something that he becomes passionate about or that really, I think God is directing the church to. But because previously you abdicated authority and responsibility, now it's harder to get something done in which you should have the authority and or responsibility to lead well through that. Yeah. So these things maybe would come back.
I want to say this hard thing, AJ. There's a chance that at some point in your ministry, you have used bureaucracy or the structures that exist as an excuse not to really lead.
Ooh, ouch.
And go, oh, well, that's not really my area. There's not really anything I can do about that. And your finance is one. Another is technology. well, I'm not really responsible for what comes out the other end. So of our, we've got a team and they're doing that. That's what I hear those things a lot. Well, we have a committee and they're really doing that. We have a team and they're really doing that. Are you the leader or aren't you? And don't hear us say, well, that means you have to make every decision. We're specifically telling you don't have to make every decision, but to abdicate responsibility also and go, well, I'm not really responsible for the outcome. You are responsible for the outcome. So, all right, that's abdicating. So first we had directing, where we've got the authority and the responsibility, and we're basically just telling people what to do.
Mm-hmm.
In abdicating, it's sort of the opposite, where we're not taking responsibility and we're not making any decisions, kind of hands off. And it really shows sort of a disregard. And I don't think it's conscious most of the time.
Yeah.
Most of the time it just happens.
Yeah.
We go, it's not really my thing. And if it bombs, it bombs.
Yep.
That's not good. The next one, I think, AJ, is maybe the most dangerous. Also very common. See it quite a bit. But what's our last alternative to empowerment?
Yeah. Our third is disabling.
Mm-hmm.
And this is giving away responsibility, but keeping authority.
Yep.
So maybe think about, talk us through kind of this scenario, Scott.
This is maybe the most complex one to understand. Like, what would that look like? If I'm keeping the authority, I'm making the decisions, but I'm sort of releasing the responsibility, not taking ownership for the outcome. So I'll give you a couple concrete examples, but first, here's why this is so bad. It places a low ceiling on the emerging leaders' development potential.
Mm-hmm.
They can't really learn because they're not allowed to make decisions. They're not allowed to sort of get behind the wheel of the car. Secondly, the ministry never multiplies because you're still making all the decisions. One person's still calling all the shots. And then that frustration ultimately snowballs because the leader never considers himself ultimately accountable and blames other people when problems arise. This is very common in sort of narcissistic leadership.
Mm-hmm.
So leaders who disable eventually discourage emerging leaders to the point that they give up. So if you are seeing a high degree of turnover in your volunteers or in your staff, this might be a red flag to you to go, oh, I wonder if I've been a disabling leader. If people are just not wanting to show back up after COVID, I'm not saying that for sure it's disabling, but think about it for a minute and make sure that that's not what's going on. So how can you discern it? How can you know if you've been disabling? Observe with whom you communicate when problems or critical decisions are made. So if you are bypassing the leader that should be taking some authority here in order to make decisions, that's a signal that you might be disabling. For example, in our worship pastor scenario, AJ, if you're going behind the worship pastor straight to the pianist to change the special music or to cut a song or to change the way that something is going on, that's disabling. Mm-hmm. Because the worship leader, the worship pastor, should be the one having that conversation, not you. And so if you are cutting people out, going around them in order to make a decision or to call a shot, that's disabling. And I think that this is one of the biggest contributing factors to stunted leadership development in churches. And what it also means is that they don't take responsibility. So it would be like this. If I'm going around the worship leader to make decisions and I'm calling the shots and I'm still telling him, we're going to do these 3 songs, and he does them, and then people respond poorly to it and go, well, I feel like that didn't really work very well. If I then said, well, yeah, worship pastor AJ, he's doing such a terrible job, isn't he? Right? Yeah. Like, you call the shots and then you're blaming him for the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
That is a quick way to get staff to quit.
Yeah.
They'll be like, no, I have no real ownership, and then you blame me when things don't work out well.
I can tell you, if I was your worship pastor, it would go horribly. Don't hire me.
Don't hire AJ to be your worship pastor. But yeah, so this is disabling when you abdicate the responsibility, let go of the responsibility, and you're going to blame that leader for the outcome. But you're still calling all the shots and telling them what to do.
Yeah,
you have to do it this way, or you're short circuiting or going around them and making decisions. That's disabling as well.
Yeah,
and I think it's really dangerous.
Yeah.
So before we wrap this up, AJ, let's kind of review. Let's recap. Let's look back at what the ideal is, and then what these three alternatives are.
Yeah. So the ideal, sort of taken from the definition, is an intentional transfer of authority and responsibility within bounds. And this would get into, we've got a whole other conversations on leadership pipeline in the church and levels of leadership. And so this is kind of built into this definition. But
yeah, go back to our couple of episodes on polity. We go into this a little bit. I think particularly part 2, I think, if I remember.
This is a couple weeks ago too. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah. I forget what that is. Maybe episode 62, 61,
somewhere in there.
So yeah, whenever you're empowering somebody and you're giving up the right amount of authority and responsibility based on their level in the organization and what needs to get done through them, this is fundamental leadership in growing your ministry. Not for the sake of growth, but for the sake of health and gospel expansion. So the necessity of this, it can't be overstated. And as Scott mentioned, a red flag even down on disabling. But if you've got high turnover in volunteers or paid staff, then you probably have got at least one of these three happening in the organization, most likely. Or just simply even stagnation. Mm-hmm. So I would say stagnation in the ministry or turnover in the ministry probably points back to this. And I'll tell you, Scott and I together have been doing this for many years now, and we almost always find unhealthy, declining, or stagnated churches. Really, the root of it comes back to the leadership of the church. And, we may or may not be able to quickly point to probably one of these things happening. But leadership, as Aubrey says, as the leader goes, so goes the church. And that is absolutely true. So, yeah, but still to get back to our recap here, directing. So 3 things that would be restricting the empowerment of leaders in your church. First one is directing. And that is when the leader retains both authority and responsibility. Abdicating, in which both of these are hands off, and the leader retains neither of those. And then finally, disabling, in which anybody beneath that leader is stunted because they're given responsibility for something, or they're scapegoats for things, but they're never given authority to make decisions and to improve and grow the ministry. So these you're gonna have to take these things and flip them around to see, the positive side of this. We've given you, as we said, sort of the negative effects, but empowerment in your ministry is extremely powerful and necessary to see, the great kingdom expansion that you want to see from your ministry. You've got to be building leaders all the time and helping them develop, giving them the necessary tools, the training that they need, but then releasing that authority and whatever level of responsibility is necessary for that as well, with you also retaining responsibility. So, think of the classic pyramid-shaped organization. That responsibility has always got to be accepted, not out of obligation, but out of desire to retain that responsibility. When there's a mind shift difference in that. If you're like, oh, I've got to be responsible for this person versus I want to be responsible for this person, you'll be building greater capacity into them. And we didn't even touch on the benefits through empowerment of communication, of mission and vision through the organization. Right. So, that could be a whole other topic. We really should do kind of a communications episode, Scott.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I hear a lot sometimes in churches is, I really don't feel like I've got a voice in the ministry.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a voice. I think what's really meant many times is I don't have any ownership.
Yeah.
I don't think it would be appropriate for every person to have a voice in everything, because you don't always have all the facts, right? You don't have all the details. You don't have the context or the nuance in order to make decisions or really to be able to give input on everything. But everyone should have input in something. They don't need to have input in everything. They need to have input in something. And it should be the thing in which that God has gifted them to act in and to serve in. And our leadership is best expressed when we're giving it away to those who are qualified and those who are called. And so I want to just bring you back, maybe to put a biblical cap on this, so you know that this isn't just, hey, here's a good idea from a good book that Aubrey wrote. But this is Ephesians 4, right? 11 through 13. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers. So the leadership gave the leaders to, verse 12, to equip his people, or to equip the saints, to equip the people in your church for works of service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God and become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. So going back to what you said, AJ, maintaining the responsibility isn't a chore. It's a privilege, because we have that same end in mind, that we would all, that the whole body of Christ would be built up. And so when we abdicate that responsibility and go, not my problem, it's sort of a middle finger to Ephesians 4. It is your problem, right? You are put in this position so that you would give away leadership to the saints, so that we could have this outcome of full maturity.
Yeah.
And when we don't give it away, or when we don't care, we're basically saying, it doesn't matter if we all attain full maturity or not, right? And so this stuff matters.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking at your church and going, I'm not seeing the leaders that I want to see, take a look at these 3 alternatives to empowerment, and just, you may be doing one or a combination of all 3 of these, depending on the context. Or maybe you're not doing any of them, but I would guess if you're not seeing the leadership development happening in your church at the level you'd like to see it, odds are good one of these 3 alternatives to empowerment is dominating your leadership style and dominating in your church. And so we'd love to answer questions that you have. We would love to hear what you have to say and help you along the way. And so shoot us an email, leadership@malfirstgroup.com. We'd love to connect with you. And you can read today's article, which again is an excerpt straight from Building Leaders, at malfirstgroup.com/64. 64, just the numbers. malfirstgroup.com/64. We'd love for you to share this episode with someone. If you're watching online, maybe subscribe. And if you are listening on a podcast app of some kind, subscribe there as well. Leave us a review. Those things are all good and helpful to us, and we appreciate you. AJ, anything else you want to say to close us out?
Thanks for being with us again this week on the Church Revitalization Podcast. We're praying for your ministry. We love you, and we're looking forward to having you back again next week.